Hey guys, tonight we journey into the heart of ancient Rome, not to witness its triumphs or politics, but to explore something darker, stranger. While Rome gave us roads, aqueducts, and legal systems, it also gave us some of the most absurd, theatrical, and downright disturbing punishments the ancient world ever saw. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Vestals buried alive, the high price of virginity. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were the spiritual equivalent of national Wi-Fi. If they went down, everything went wrong. These women were hand-picked before puberty to serve the goddess Vesta, keeper of the eternal flame. Their job? Keep that sacred fire burning, and more importantly, stay away from men. For 30 years. Now, breaking a vow of chastity in ancient Rome wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated like detonating a nuke in the middle of the Senate. If a Vestal was caught fooling around, the punishment was literally being buried alive. Yes, alive. Not metaphorically cancelled, not sent to the naughty corner, straight up entombed underground. Why buried and not, say, executed with a sword like a normal ancient crime? Simple. Romans believed you couldn't spill a Vestal's blood. It would offend the gods. So they found a delightful loophole. Dig a pit, lower her in with a flickering oil lamp, a little bread, and a pitcher of water. Because, hey, hydration matters. And then seal her in. Voila, no blood, no mess, no divine tantrums. The poor girl would lie there in the dark, thinking about her life choices while Rome dusted off its hands and moved on. You'd think the guys she got caught with would suffer the same fate, but nah, they were usually whipped to death in public. Still brutal, just quicker. To be fair, becoming a Vestal was a big honour. You got front row seats at the games, travelled in fancy carriages, and even had the power to pardon condemned prisoners with a single word. But all of that came with one little catch. Mess up once, and you're sleeping underground, permanently. And yes, Rome took it that seriously. One famous Vestal, Cornelia, was accused during Emperor Domitian's reign. Before being sentenced, she reportedly shouted, "Does Caesar think I've had sex with a god then? Because no mortal man touched me?" Bold move. Didn't work. So if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by your job, just remember, at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you in a hole with some stale bread and a dusty oil lamp. Rome, where HR policies were written in stone, and fear. Poena cullae, death in a sack, with animal roommates. Ah, ancient Rome, the birthplace of philosophy, architecture, and punishments that sound like fever dreams. Let's talk about Poena cullae, which translates to penalty of the sack. And no, this isn't some quirky medieval game show. It's what happened if you committed the ultimate Roman taboo, killing your father. Romans didn't just slap you with a fine or toss you in jail. No. If you murdered dear old dad, they gave you the deluxe punishment package, starring you and 4 unfortunate animals. First, the Romans would tie your hands, maybe give you a moment to reflect on your life choices. Spoiler, you'd made bad ones. Then sew you into a large leather sack. Sounds cozy, right? But it gets better. Joining you in the sack were a dog, for loyalty you lacked, a monkey, because why not add chaos, a snake, to slither through your regrets, and a rooster, perhaps to announce your doom at sunrise. Then the sack, now bursting with bad decisions and animal rage, was hurled into a river, ideally a deep one. The result? A flailing, yelping, screeching, hissing blender of panic and poetic justice. No one really knows why these specific animals were chosen, but historians think it was symbolic. Dogs represented family, monkeys chaos, snakes deceit, and roosters vigilance. Basically, your sins made flesh and feathers. Can you imagine the moment inside that sack? You're being headbutted by a monkey while a snake coils around your leg, the dog's losing its mind, and the rooster thinks it's a Tuesday. If this sounds like the worst escape room ever, you're not far off. The punishment was rare, thankfully, but Rome revived it occasionally just to make a point, usually under emperors who loved the theatrical. It wasn't just about killing the criminal, it was about making a statement, and maybe traumatizing a few spectators while they were at it. So next time your dad makes a lame joke or forgets your birthday, just be glad you weren't born in Rome. Back then, patricide didn't mean therapy. It meant sack time with the serpent circus. Crucifixion. But upside down, flipping the script on suffering. When we hear the word crucifixion, most of us think of one thing: a wooden cross, a slow, agonizing death, and a warning to anyone watching not to mess with the state. It was Rome's signature punishment, brutal, public, and humbling. But leave it to the Romans to occasionally throw in a little creative flair. Enter the inverted crucifixion. Yes, upside down. Because apparently, dying upright wasn't humiliating enough. This method was reserved for special cases, usually people the authorities really wanted to make an example of. Criminals, traitors, and occasionally rebels who insisted on being difficult even in death. But perhaps the most famous upside-down crucifixion was that of St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to tradition, when Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion under Emperor Nero, he made a strange request. "Crucify me upside down. I'm not worthy to die like my Lord." And Rome, being the efficiency machine that it was, said, "Sure, why not?" Now here's where things get a little intense. Crucifixion was already one of the worst ways to die, combining asphyxiation, blood loss, and total public humiliation. But flipping the body changed the dynamic. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained in unnatural ways, breathing became nearly impossible, and it hurt. A lot. Think of it like this. It's the difference between sitting through a boring lecture and sitting through that lecture upside down while someone drives nails into your ankles. Not quite the same vibe. But this wasn't just about suffering. It was about symbolism. An inverted cross became, ironically, a symbol of humility. Peter's choice was meant to show reverence, not rebellion. Unfortunately, that image later got co-opted by horror movies and metal bands, giving it a very different PR spin. The Romans, they didn't care about the symbolism. For them, it was about sending a message. Cross us, and we'll make your death as weird and memorable as possible. So the next time you're hanging out, hopefully not literally, remember that ancient Rome could turn any punishment into performance art. Upside-down crucifixion wasn't just death. It was death with dramatic direction. Decimation, the original team-building exercise with a twist of trauma. When you think of a motivational speech, you might picture a coach yelling, "We win together, we lose together," but in ancient Rome the phrase could easily have been, "We march together," or "1 in 10 of you dies." Welcome to the charming world of decimation, a military punishment so brutal it makes modern boot camp look like a spa day. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit showed cowardice in battle, tried to desert or mutinied, the commander had a nuclear option. Not in the explosive sense, more like the psychological warfare sense. The entire group would be lined up, and every 10 soldiers would draw lots. The lucky one? He got beaten to death by his 9 comrades, with clubs, stones, or whatever was nearby. Yes, you heard that right. Not only did you face death, you also had to kill your buddy, the guy you probably just shared wine and bread with the night before, all to prove loyalty to Rome. It was like Survivor, Roman Legion edition, except nobody won immunity and everyone left traumatized. And don't assume they got a break afterward. The 9 survivors didn't get high fives and a long weekend. Nope. They were given barley instead of wheat for rations, a Roman way of saying, "We're disappointed in you," and forced to camp outside the fort's safety. The logic behind decimation was cold but effective. If you feared your own comrades more than the enemy, you'd think twice about running away. And oddly, it worked. Roman discipline was legendary, and decimation kept soldiers marching in line, even if they had to step over a few bodies to do it. One of the most infamous uses of decimation was by Crassus, the wealthy general who formed a triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. After a humiliating defeat in the Spartacus slave revolt, he decimated a disgraced unit. Because nothing says, "we're back on track," like a casual in-house massacre. So next time your boss says, "we need to boost team accountability," just be glad you're not living under Crassus. In Rome, failure wasn't just punished, it was distributed. The fork of heretics, a medieval neck workout. Nobody asked for. Let's say you lived in ancient Rome, or more accurately, the later Roman Empire, during those twilight centuries when things got weirder, darker, and way more obsessed with heresy. You spoke out against the church or challenged some sacred belief. Rome didn't just scold you. It gifted you an accessory you'd never forget, the fork of heretics. Picture this, a metal rod with two prongs at each end. One end pointed up under your chin, the other jammed right into your upper chest. A miniature trident sandwiching your neck. Sounds uncomfortable? Oh, we're just getting started. Once this lovely device was strapped on, you were forbidden to move your head. At all. Look down. Stabbed. Nod off. Stabbed. Try to whisper a heretical thought to the guy next to you. Stabbed by your own collar. It didn't draw blood, at least not at first. That was the genius. The fork wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to exhaust you. Mentally, physically, spiritually. You'd be left standing sometimes for days, straining every muscle just to avoid impaling yourself. It was like playing a game of don't move, where the prize was not slowly skewering your own throat. And while we call it the fork of heretics, it was also used on blasphemers, witches, suspected liars, and anyone who annoyed a bishop before breakfast. It was versatile torture, custom fit for silence, stillness, and soul-shattering discomfort. To make things even more theatrical, the fork sometimes had little Latin inscriptions engraved on it. Things like, "I renounce my sin," or "I am guilty," because nothing boosts your confession like being slowly impaled by typography. What's wild is that this punishment wasn't even one of Rome's most extreme. It was more of a starter pack for sinners. No blood, no public execution, just quiet suffering and internal panic. A sort of intro course in agony, Heresy 101. So if you've ever tried to hold in a sneeze during a serious meeting, imagine doing that for 3 days straight, with iron poking at your throat. In Rome, silence wasn't golden. It was enforced, with 2 rusty prongs and a neck cramp from the gods. Thrown from the Tarpeian rock, Rome's original unfriend button. Forget passive-aggressive texts, or dramatic social media unfollows. In ancient Rome, if you betrayed the state, they didn't just cut you off. They threw you off a cliff. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock. A jagged 80-foot drop on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, just a short stroll from the Roman Forum. It wasn't just a scenic viewpoint. It was where the Republic took out the trash, by launching traitors straight off it. And yes, it was just as theatrical as it sounds. Now, the rock got its name from Tarpeia, a Roman girl who betrayed the city to enemy Sabines in exchange for what she thought would be shiny gold bracelets. The Sabines, ever the literal thinkers, crushed her with their shields instead, technically fulfilling the deal. Her body was tossed from the cliff, and the rock was named in her honour. Moral of the story? Don't trust invaders or vague payment plans. But after that, the Tarpeian Rock became Rome's favourite tool for dealing with traitors, corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone who made the state go, yeah, this one needs dramatic punishment. No hanging, no sword, just a short flight and a sudden stop. The condemned were often stripped, paraded, and then marched to the edge, where gravity handled the sentencing. And yes, there was usually a crowd. Nothing like a good old-fashioned execution to spice up market day. It was public, it was final, and it was symbolic. You weren't just dying, you were being removed from the city, physically and spiritually. The ultimate cancel culture, Rome edition. Interestingly, the rock sat just a stone's throw away from the Temple of Jupiter, which meant that if you lied to the gods or the state, your final moments included a front-row view of heaven. Briefly. Over time, more elaborate punishments came along. Lions, crucifixions, burning tunics. But the Tarpeian rock remained a classic, elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its message. So next time someone says, they really threw him under the bus, remind them, the Romans did it first. No wheels, just stone, and betrayal echoing through the hills. Damnatio ad bestias, death by lion, applause, optional. Welcome to the Colosseum. Stone, sweat, and 50,000 roaring fans. Ancient Rome's version of cable TV. Today's main event? Damnatio ad bestias, or as we'd call it, being fed to wild animals while everyone eats snacks. This punishment, meaning condemnation to the beasts, was Rome's go-to for criminals, traitors, prisoners of war, and, most tragically, Christians who wouldn't bow to imperial gods. And make no mistake, this wasn't just about death. It was about spectacle. Rome didn't believe in boring executions. They believed in theatre. The condemned were tossed into an arena where hungry lions, leopards, bears, or sometimes even elephants were waiting. But here's the twist. Rome being Rome, they often dressed the victims up first. That's right, they turned their deaths into morality plays. One unlucky soul might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be mauled mid-lyre solo. Another might play a mythological villain like Prometheus, only for birds to peck at him in accurate reenactment. It was entertainment, justice, and religious propaganda, all rolled into one fur-covered disaster. You might ask, did they even have a chance to defend themselves? Absolutely not. This wasn't a trial. This was a death sentence wrapped in applause. The crowd came to see blood. And if the lions were sleepy that day, no problem. Romans had tricks, like poking them with hot irons or starving them for a couple of days beforehand. Showtime must go on. And remember, this wasn't limited to hardened criminals. You could end up in the arena for theft, political dissent, or even being on the wrong side of religious law. The only thing standing between you and lion lunch? Favour from a very generous emperor. But don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't just sadism. It was calculated. A warning to anyone watching. Step out of line, and this could be you. Rome ruled by fear and felines. In time, the Christian martyrs flipped the script, turning beastly death into a badge of honour. But for most, damnatio ad bestias was less about glory and more about gore. So the next time you grumble about jury duty, be glad it doesn't involve dressing as a myth and dodging leopards. Forced suicide with honour, when Rome let you die with dignity. Kinda in ancient Rome, getting a death sentence didn't always mean you were dragged to the arena or tossed off a cliff. Sometimes, if you were lucky, or rather, politically connected, you got a special kind of punishment. Forced suicide. Sounds contradictory, right? We're not going to kill you, but we strongly suggest you do it yourself. Here's how it worked. If you were a senator, a noble, or just someone high enough in Roman society to own more than one tunic, and you managed to offend the emperor, maybe by plotting a coup, maybe just by existing too confidently, you'd receive a quiet visit. A scroll would be delivered, a polite message from the emperor, and it would go something like this. You have dishonoured the state. Please, take the honourable route out. Translation: kill yourself by sunset, or we'll do it for you, and make it nasty. The upside? If you complied, your family got to keep your property. Your name might even be left unblemished in the records. Maybe. It was the Roman version of a severance package, with blood instead of paperwork. This wasn't considered a humiliation. It was viewed as noble. In fact, many elites saw it as a final act of control. A chance to write their own ending, sometimes literally. Think warm bath, a blade to the wrist, and a final monologue, very on-brand for Rome's love of drama. The philosopher Seneca the Younger famously faced this fate. Accused of being part of a conspiracy against Nero, possibly falsely, he was told to end things himself. He slit his wrists, then his ankles, but the bleeding would always kill you. Sometimes, they just let you do it beautifully. The wooden donkey, when sitting became a crime. If you've ever complained about an uncomfortable chair, ancient Rome would like a word, because one of their more imaginative punishments involved a piece of furniture, the now infamous wooden donkey, or as it should have been called, the pain pony of doom. This device wasn't an actual donkey, of course. It was a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam, shaped like an A-frame with a razor-thin peak. The condemned, usually thieves, slaves, or rebellious soldiers, were forced to straddle it. That's right. Their entire body weight pressed down on that sharp edge, right between the legs. But wait, it gets worse. To really drive the point home, pun intended, weights were often tied to the person's ankles. Gravity did the rest. The longer you sat, the more the beam tore into your flesh. Slowly, painfully, and depending on how generous the executioner was feeling, you might be left there for hours. Now, the Romans didn't invent the wooden donkey. It likely came from earlier Middle Eastern torture traditions. But oh, did they embrace it with flair. Because if there was one thing Rome loved, it was punishment with pageantry. This wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it was just used as a very persuasive form of public humiliation. Picture it. A crowded square. A merchant caught cheating customers, now wailing atop the donkey while kids laughed and vendors sold snacks. It was pain, performance, and a life lesson all in one. Even worse, Roman generals sometimes used it as field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed could find themselves straddling the donkey as a reminder to follow orders, because nothing says morale booster like internal bleeding. And yes, there were occasional modifications. Some donkeys were metal, some had spikes. One record even mentions a heated version, because apparently Rome was taking feedback and innovating on the fly. It was humiliating, it was brutal, and it turned the simple act of sitting into a punishment that could scar you for life, physically and mentally. So the next time your office chair feels a bit stiff, just remember, at least it's not a sharp triangle and no one's tying rocks to your feet. In ancient Rome, bad posture wasn't your biggest problem. The furniture was. Branding the face, when your mugshot was permanent. In a world without ID cards, background checks, or Google searches, ancient Rome had a simple solution for keeping track of criminals. Just burn it onto their face. Yes, we're talking about branding. Not the kind companies do with logos, but the kind where your actual forehead becomes a crime label. And if you were a thief, runaway slave, or repeat offender, congratulations, you now had a permanent facial feature that screamed, "Do not trust this guy." The branding was usually done with a heated metal rod, pressed into the skin with the gentle mercy of a blacksmith on a deadline. Letters like F for fur, thief, or C for calumnia, false accuser, were scorched onto your forehead or cheek. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a one-star Yelp review, but on your skull. And this wasn't done in some private back room. Oh no. Branding was public, a spectacle, a lesson. The idea was humiliate the criminal, and others will think twice. It wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda, sizzling straight into flesh. Now imagine living with that mark. Walking through the market, everyone knows. Trying to get a job? Good luck. Flirting with someone? Forget it. You weren't a person anymore. You were a walking crime scene. Runaway slaves were especially targeted. Many were branded with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, meaning escapee. And if they ran again after that, harsher branding, or worse. Slaves weren't just property. They were expected to wear their disobedience like a badge. Some clever folks tried to remove or disguise the marks through cuts, tattoos, or even makeup. But Rome, ever prepared, made those acts punishable too. Tampering with your brand was like trying to Photoshop your criminal record. It didn't fly. Later, emperors like Constantine tried to tone it down, suggesting brands be placed on the hands or legs instead of the face. But even then, the point was the same: permanent shame. So the next time someone says, "Face your consequences," just be glad they don't mean that literally. Because in ancient Rome, they didn't just remember your crime. They made sure your face did too. Tongue removal for blasphemy. Say goodbye to small talk. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech was conditional. You could praise the emperor, debate philosophy, and recite poetry. Just don't blaspheme. Because if you badmouthed the gods, insulted the emperor, or whispered the wrong words in the wrong ears, you might find yourself on the receiving end of a punishment that's both literal and horrifying. Tongue removal. Yes, they really did it. The logic was simple. If your words were dangerous, Rome would silence you, permanently. The process wasn't exactly subtle. There was no anesthesia, no sterile tools, just forceps, iron, and pain. A soldier or executioner would clamp your tongue, slice it off, or in some cases, rip it out entirely. It wasn't surgery. It was state-approved censorship. And it wasn't always about religion. Sure, blaspheming against the gods was a fast track to punishment, especially if you mocked Jupiter in public or questioned the sacred fires. But often, blasphemy meant speaking out against the emperor or the empire's moral order. Basically, if your mouth made powerful people uncomfortable, you were suddenly a medical emergency. One wrong joke, one heretical whisper, one rebellious chant, snip. This punishment wasn't just brutal, it was theatrical. Public tongue removals sent a clear message. Words have power, but ours has more. And even if you survived the ordeal, life afterward wasn't exactly a picnic. You couldn't speak clearly. You couldn't argue your innocence. You couldn't even scream properly. It was isolation through mutilation. A scarlet letter carved not into your skin, but into your silence. Ironically, some of the earliest Christian martyrs suffered this fate. They refused to renounce their faith and kept preaching. Rome couldn't silence their ideas, so it went for the messenger, literally. Of course, the Christians then turned these stories into tales of divine courage, which only made the Romans more furious. If you're thinking this sounds extreme, remember, Rome was obsessed with control, and there's no better way to control a person than by cutting out their voice. So next time someone tells you to hold your tongue, be thankful it's just a figure of speech, because in ancient Rome, they meant it. Breaking on the wheel, when your bones became art. If you thought the Romans were running out of creative ways to destroy a person, allow us to introduce the wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, or for those with a dramatic flair, the Catherine wheel, named later in medieval times. It was less an execution and more a macabre sculpture session using the human body as raw material. Here's how it worked. First, the condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread, like a grisly human starfish. Then, an executioner armed with a heavy iron bar would begin the real work, smashing the limbs, one by one, slowly, deliberately. The goal wasn't to kill right away. Oh no. The goal was to shatter the bones while keeping the victim alive, snap the arms, crush the thighs, twist the ankles so they no longer looked like ankles. The body would fold unnaturally, becoming a grotesque display of pain and precision. But the pièce de résistance. The broken body was then woven through the wheel's spokes, limbs bent and threaded like a nightmarish macrame project. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted up on a pole, like a flag of warning. Other times, it was left to spin gently in the wind, because why not add ambiance? This wasn't just about punishment. It was public messaging. breaking on the wheel was used for crimes considered especially vile, like murder, treason, or highway robbery. It said to the crowd, "This is what happens when you step too far out of line. And you didn't just die. You decayed in full view. Survivors? Rare. But here's the twisted twist. If someone did survive the ordeal, say they were still breathing after a day or two, they were sometimes shown mercy with a final blow to the chest or neck. Sometimes. As horrifying as this sounds, the punishment outlived Rome. Medieval Europe loved it so much they turned it into an art form, adding spikes, fires, and dramatic scripts. Rome had simply set the stage. So next time you think your commute is rough, remember, at least you're not strapped to a wooden wheel, becoming the centerpiece of a public bone gallery. In Rome, justice wasn't blind. It was bold, brutal, and built for maximum exposure. Execution by hot ash, death by the grainy slow burn. When it came to killing creatively, ancient Rome always had something simmering. Literally, enter one of its lesser-known but deeply disturbing punishments, execution by hot ash. It's not as famous as crucifixion or the lions, but it might just be one of the slowest and most psychologically terrifying ways to die ever devised. No swords, no bloodshed, no quick release, just ashes. Heated, suffocating, and endless. This gruesome method is credited, unsurprisingly, to Emperor Nero, a man who treated executions like performance art. In one recorded instance, Nero had an enemy buried up to the neck in a pit. So far, classic Rome. But instead of beheading or stoning him, Nero added a twist. A funnel was inserted into the man's mouth, and hot ash was slowly poured in. Not boiling water, not fire, ash. At first glance it seems harmless. Ashes are soft, right? But here's where the genius horror kicks in. The ash is scorching. It clogs the throat, sears the lungs, and suffocates from within. It doesn't kill fast. It chokes. Slowly, gradually. You feel every moment, every breath turning to fire, every swallow becoming your last. And as the ash settles, you're not bleeding. You're not burned on the outside. But inside, everything is failing. It's death by dust. Death by suffocation dressed as silence. Why ash, though? Because it was humiliating, undignified. Ashes were the remnants of destruction, used to clean filth, wipe away traces of things burned. To die in ash was symbolic. It meant you were beneath notice, unworthy of steel or flame. You weren't even worth a dramatic death, just the slow grind of what was left over. It's worth noting this punishment wasn't common. It was reserved for those Nero really didn't like. People whose very existence he wanted erased quietly, yet with maximum psychological torment. And to the crowd, it didn't look like much. No blood, no screams. Just a man in a hole, and a trickle of grey dust. So the next time someone tells you, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember that in Nero's Rome, that wasn't just poetic. It was protocol. The tunica molesta, Rome's deadliest wardrobe malfunction. In ancient Rome, fashion didn't kill, unless you were wearing the tunica molesta, or as we might call it, the flammable death robe. Picture this. You're led into an arena or strapped to a stake, and instead of chains or ropes, the executioner approaches you with a tunic. Oh good, you think. At least they're giving me something to wear. Then you notice it's dripping, not with water, but with pitch, tar, and oil. This is the tunica molesta, literally annoying tunic, but more accurately, highly flammable nightmare onesie. It was a garment soaked in combustible material, fitted snugly, and then set on fire while you were still very much alive and inside it. This wasn't just a method of execution, it was a public performance. Most famously used under emperors like Nero, who turned executions into after-dinner entertainment. During his infamous garden parties, Nero would use the tunica molesta to light the grounds, human torches illuminating his twisted vision of Roman leisure. Who wore it? Arsonists, traitors, Christians, anyone deemed worthy of a particularly theatrical end. The flames clung to the body, melting skin, igniting hair and searing lungs. And there was no escape, no rolling to put it out. The tunic stuck to you. It burned with you. And because Rome loved a good mythological reference, they sometimes modelled it after Hercules' poison shirt, a garment that caused the hero unbearable agony before his death. Rome didn't just kill you, they made it poetic. The real genius, if we can call it that, was in the psychology. You weren't just dying. You were displayed. Shrieking, flailing, engulfed in fire while crowds watched. It sent a message clearer than any stone inscription. This is what happens when you cross the empire. Some records even suggest music was played during the burning. Nero reportedly plucked his lyre as the flames rose. Talk about a hot performance. So if you ever complain that your clothes are uncomfortable or too tight, be glad they're not soaked in oil and part of a public execution ceremony. Because in Rome, fashion didn't just make a statement, it screamed, damnatio memoriae. When Rome deleted you from history, most Roman punishments ended with the body, but some, they reached further. Into memory, into legacy, into obliteration. This is damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, Rome's most haunting punishment of all, because what's worse than death? Being forgotten on purpose. If you were an emperor who embarrassed the state, a general who rebelled, or a senator who fell too far from grace, Rome might not just kill you, they would erase you. Completely. Statues, smashed or defaced, inscriptions, chiseled out, portraits, painted over. Your name? Struck from official documents, coins and monuments. If you had achievements, they were reassigned. If you had supporters, they were silenced. And the most devastating part? It worked. Many of the people subjected to damnatio memoriae were powerful, known, feared. Yet today, we don't even remember their names, because Rome was that good at deletion. Whole reigns vanish into silence. It's historical vaporization. One of the most famous examples was Emperor Geta, brother of Caracalla. After Caracalla had him assassinated, in their own mother's arms no less, he didn't stop there. He ordered Geta's image removed from every mosaic, painting and bust. Thousands of inscriptions were edited, his name scratched out by hand. In some surviving art, you can still see the ghost of Geta's figure. Awkward gaps, half faces, names partially scraped away. It's chilling, like history caught in the act of forgetting. But damnatio memoriae wasn't just about vengeance. It was about control. If Rome could rewrite the past, it could sculpt the future. If you could make it seem like someone never existed, then maybe their ideas didn't exist either. It was the empire's way of saying, you were never here, and if anyone says otherwise, they'll be next. There's something terrifyingly modern about it too. We talk today about cancel culture, social erasure, reputations destroyed in hours. But Rome was doing it 2,000 years ago, just with chisels instead of tweets. So as we close this strange journey through Rome's most bizarre punishments, remember this: the cruelest punishment wasn't fire, or lions, or ropes. It was the silence that followed. Because in ancient Rome, the worst thing that could happen to you was to be forgotten. In the early 1800s, the American landscape stretched endlessly westward, wild, unknown, and whispering promises to those bold enough to chase them. The east, crowded with cities, factories, and fading farmland, had begun to feel tight, constrictive. But the west, that was the dream. A blank canvas with just enough danger to make the paint stick. It began as a whisper, in taverns, in church pews, around dinner tables. Stories of open land, of rivers that shimmered like silver, of valleys that bloomed without effort. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had more than doubled the size of the young United States. Suddenly, there was space, unimaginable space, and it belonged to no one, or so the government claimed. For many, The West was more than a direction on a compass. It was a fresh start, a place where your name didn't carry your debts, where nobody asked where you were from, only what you could do with your hands. It called to dreamers and desperados alike, farmers looking for new soil, widows seeking peace, and adventurers chasing legends carved out of campfire tales. There were no highways, no guarantees, and no second chances. Every journey westward began with uncertainty. Would the wagon survive the mountains? Would the river freeze too soon? Would there be food on the other side? And yet, tens of thousands went. Entire families, with infants swaddled in flour sacks and grandmothers tucked between crates of salted pork, set off into the unknown. To go west was to gamble everything, but to stay behind felt like surrendering to a life of limits. The frontier wasn't just a place on a map. It was a test of will, of grit, of the ability to carve order out of chaos using nothing but timber, steel, and raw hope. And as the sun sank behind endless prairies and mountain ridges, casting long shadows on wagon wheels and weary faces, one thing was clear. America's story wasn't written yet. It was being dragged slowly westward, one rickety mile at a time. Before the pioneers could brave the wild frontier, they had to build a vessel that would carry not just supplies, but their entire future. Enter the covered wagon, the backbone of the westward migration. It was no stagecoach or fancy carriage. It was a wooden box on wheels, held together by sweat, hope, and iron nails. Most families didn't build wagons from scratch. They bought them or modified existing carts. The most famous type was the Conestoga, but on the frontier, something smaller, lighter, and cheaper was needed. That became the prairie schooner, so named because its canvas top, billowing in the wind, looked like a ship sailing across grassy seas. But this ship didn't carry gold or jewels. It carried salted pork, flour, beans, cast-iron pots, a spinning wheel, a Bible, and maybe one good quilt. Every inch was accounted for. Space was life. And weight? Weight could kill you. A fully loaded wagon might hold up to 2,000 pounds, any more, and the oxen pulling it would collapse long before you reached the Rockies. Horses were too delicate, mules too expensive. Oxen were the true engines of expansion, slow, stubborn, but unbreakable. Families slept in the wagons, under them or beside them. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. And despite what Hollywood suggests, people didn't ride inside all day. That would jostle bones and bruise backs. Most walked, mile after mile, day after blistering day. Wagons weren't just transportation. They were survival pods. They held medicines, spare wagon tongues, gunpowder, and seeds. Some even carried baby chicks in boxes beneath the wagon bed to start a coop once the family settled. And yet, for all their practicality, wagons were also symbolic. They were hope on wheels. Once the oxen were yoked, once the wheels creaked into motion, there was no turning back. The house was sold. The land behind was gone. All that remained was the trail, the sky, and the belief that something better lay ahead. Every bump, every cracked axle, every muddy crossing was one line written in the story of American expansion, carved not in ink, but in wheel ruts and willpower. Life on the trail was not the romantic adventure story some might imagine. It was long, grueling, and soaked in dust. Each day began before sunrise. Roosters weren't needed. The creak of leather harnesses and the groan of wagon wheels were alarm clocks enough. The average wagon train moved about 10 to 15 miles per day, depending on weather, terrain, and how many axles broke that morning. Over time, trails like the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California routes carved themselves into the earth, each lined with discarded belongings, broken wheels, and the graves of those who never made it west. Meals were simple, hearty, and endlessly repetitive. Coffee was a luxury, water a gamble. Streams could be clean or crawling with bacteria. Boiling it helped, if you had the fuel and time. Otherwise it was luck and prayer. Food was rationed, salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and sometimes wild game, if someone could shoot straight. Wild onions and berries became treasured delicacies. Illness was the greatest killer on the trail. Cholera swept through camps like wildfire. It came from contaminated water and killed quickly, within hours sometimes. Dysentery, scurvy, and snake bites took others. There were no doctors, only home remedies and hope. Sometimes hope wasn't enough. Still, there were moments of joy. Children played with sticks and stones, or skipped along the wagon's shadow. Weddings occasionally took place on the trail. So did births. Entire families were forged not just by blood, but by shared hardship and dust-soaked camaraderie. At night, the wagons circled, not to fend off native attacks, as often mythologized, but for protection against thieves, animals, and the cold wind. Fires were lit, bread was baked on hot stones, and someone might pull out a fiddle. For a few hours, laughter and music pushed back the darkness, but rest was always brief. Tomorrow brought more walking, more wilderness, and fewer guarantees. Life on the trail was survival by routine. You learned to love your boots and hate your blisters. You learned to mourn quietly and move forward anyway. Because the land didn't wait for grief, it only moved west. After weeks or even months on the trail, the sight of trees, water, and flat land was enough to make a pioneer fall to their knees in gratitude. But celebration was short-lived, because once a family found their spot, the real work began. Homesteading wasn't glamorous. There were no pre-built homes waiting, no fences, no roads, just open land and the ticking clock of the seasons. The first priority? Shelter. Usually a one-room log cabin, barely large enough to hold the family that built it. Tools were limited, and every log had to be felled, trimmed, and hauled by hand or oxen. No chainsaws, no blueprints, just axes, grit, and guesswork. Most cabins had dirt floors, which turned to mud in the rain and froze solid in winter. Windows were often just holes covered with animal hide or greased paper to let in light while keeping out the worst of the cold. A chimney was luxury. Many cabins started with simple holes in the roof to vent smoke. You coughed a lot. Inside, the family slept on piles of straw, furs, or corn husks. Beds were made from rope strung across wooden frames. If you were lucky, the gaps between logs were sealed with mud and moss to keep out the wind. If you weren't, the wind came in anyway. And then came the first winter, the season that tested every soul. If the family hadn't stored enough firewood or food, the months ahead could mean starvation or frostbite. Snowstorms might trap them inside for days. Coyotes howled in the dark. Wolves circled. But still the frontier spirit endured. Families made candles from animal fat. Children learned to patch clothes and cook over open fires. They read from the Bible by firelight. They wrote letters home, if there was a place to send them. Neighbours were few and far between. But when a new cabin appeared on the horizon, help was offered. A shared roof raising, a borrowed cow, a hot meal. Survival wasn't about toughness. It was about community. One family couldn't last, but 10 might. The first winter on the frontier wasn't just cold. It was a quiet crucible, where dreams were either hardened into resolve or buried beneath the snow. On the American frontier, strength wasn't measured in muscle alone. It was measured in endurance, sacrifice, and quiet, relentless courage. And no one embodied that more than frontier women. Forget the dainty damsels of dime novels. These women were warriors in aprons. The moment they stepped off the wagon, they became builders, farmers, midwives, butchers, doctors, and teachers, all wrapped into one. If something needed doing, they did it, because there was no one else. They woke before dawn to churn butter, bake bread, and milk cows, all before most men even rubbed their eyes. They planted gardens, preserved food, tended to livestock, and sewed everything the family wore, often from scratch. In times of sickness, they administered herbal remedies. In childbirth, they acted as midwives, sometimes for neighbours, sometimes for themselves, alone. A woman on the frontier could kill a snake with a shovel in the morning and teach her children to read by afternoon. She might lose a child to fever and still have dinner on the table by sundown. Guns were no stranger to their hands. If their husbands were away, or gone for good, women defended the homestead with whatever was available: rifles, axes, frying pans. There are stories of women fending off wolves, outlaws, and even raiders, all while holding a baby on one hip. Loneliness was the enemy too. For some, the nearest neighbour might be miles away. Letters took weeks, even months, to arrive. The silence could be deafening. And yet, these women endured, knitting civilization from wilderness, one stitch, one lesson, one loaf at a time. Frontier women also formed the heart of community. They organised barn raisings, cared for sick neighbours, and hosted Sunday gatherings when churches were still only blueprints. When towns finally sprang up, it was often the women who insisted on schools, libraries, and law. They weren't background characters in the story of the frontier. They were the backbone. Uncelebrated, overworked, and often overlooked, yet impossible to forget once you knew their strength. So, the next time you picture the Wild West, don't just think of cowboys on horses. Think of a woman, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled up, shotgun by the door, and cornbread in the oven. For every wagon that rolled westward, for every cabin raised and field ploughed, there was already someone there. The American frontier wasn't empty. It was occupied by hundreds of indigenous nations who had called the land home for centuries, even millennia. From the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, the land was deeply woven with native life: hunting grounds, sacred sites, migration paths, rivers filled with meaning. But to the US government, and to most pioneers, this wasn't seen as home. It was seen as potential, and so began a long, painful unravelling of promises. The US government signed treaty after treaty with native tribes, agreements that promised peace, land rights, and resources. But almost every one of these treaties was broken. As settlers poured westward, tribes were pushed back, then pushed again. Sometimes it was with ink, sometimes with fire and bullets. Entire nations were forced onto reservations, often barren and far from ancestral homes. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Lakota, Comanche, and dozens more were made strangers on their own land. Some native groups tried diplomacy, others resisted. Armed conflicts erupted. The Black Hawk War, the Sand Creek Massacre, Little Bighorn. But even when native warriors won a battle, they lost the war. The government simply kept coming, with troops, with railroads, with settlers hungry for space and willing to claim it at any cost. It wasn't just a land grab. It was cultural erasure. Children were taken from families, sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages. Sacred traditions were outlawed. Native identity was treated as something to be erased, civilized, or rewritten. And yet, through it all, indigenous peoples survived. Their languages were whispered in secret. Their songs were sung in defiance. Their stories passed down like living fire. The romantic image of the frontier often forgets this cost. But the truth remains. Westward expansion was not a triumph for all. For many, it was a slow, devastating march of loss. To understand the American frontier is to hold both truths at once: the resilience of pioneers and the tragedy of the people they displaced. Because history, like the land itself, holds more than one story. On the American frontier, law and order arrived late, and sometimes not at all. In many newly settled towns, there were no police, no courthouses, and no jails. Justice was less about due process, and more about who had the loudest voice, the fastest draw, or the biggest gang behind them. In short, the law on the frontier wore many faces, and not all of them were good guys. At first, it was the vigilantes who stepped in. Citizens' committees would form when a crime was committed: a horse stolen, a shop robbed, or worse. They held makeshift trials in saloons or under trees. And if guilt was assumed, punishment came fast. A bullet, a rope, or being run out of town with a warning and a bruised ego. Eventually, the towns grew, and with them came lawmen, sheriffs, marshals and deputies. Names like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson and Wild Bill Hickok became legend. Some were brave, some were crooked. Most were a little of both. With a tin badge and a revolver, they were the thin line between chaos and order. But just as quickly as lawmen arrived, so did the outlaws. The frontier was a magnet for drifters, deserters, gamblers and gunslingers looking to vanish into the dust. Men like Billy the Kid, Jesse James and Butch Cassidy didn't just rob banks and trains. They captured imaginations. Newspapers turned them into folk heroes, even as they left trails of bodies and broken safes behind. Frontier justice was unpredictable. A man could be hanged for stealing a horse, or walk free after a murder if the jury liked his story better. Bribes worked. So did threats. And sometimes, justice was just revenge in a fancier hat. Even the courtroom, when it existed, was often little more than a general store with a judge who also ran the hardware counter. Despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, frontier communities slowly built systems of law. Judges replaced vigilantes. Prisons replaced tree limbs. But the myths never died, and maybe they never will. Because on the edge of the known world, justice wasn't blind. It was armed, dusty, and didn't ask twice. At first, the American frontier moved at the speed of a wagon wheel, slow, creaky, and weather permitting. But by the mid to late 1800s, the silence of the prairie was shattered by a new sound. The steam whistle. The arrival of the railroad changed everything. Suddenly, journeys that once took months by wagon could be completed in days. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected east to west in a steel embrace that transformed the frontier from wilderness into a corridor of commerce. Settlers flooded in. Towns popped up overnight beside new depots. And goods, everything from stoves to sewing needles, arrived by train, no longer hoarded or handmade. For pioneers, the railroad meant survival. It meant medicine could arrive before a fever turned deadly. It meant crops could be sold beyond the local market. It meant letters, long delayed by weather and rivers, could now travel in days. The frontier became less of a gamble and more of a calculated risk. But the railroad didn't come alone. Alongside it ran the telegraph wire, thin, humming strands of copper that stitched the country together with dots and dashes. The telegraph gave the frontier something it had never had before: instant communication. A rancher in Wyoming could get news of a presidential election within minutes. A sheriff could call for help from 100 miles away. Isolation, the great fear of the early pioneer, was dying, one beep at a time. The impact was huge. Economies expanded. Government reached farther. Law enforcement got faster. But not everyone welcomed it. Indigenous tribes saw railroads and telegraph poles as intrusions. Signals that the land they once roamed freely was now bound by wires and owned in sections. Some fought back, sabotaging lines, derailing trains, delaying the inevitable. Yet progress rolled on. The iron horse was unstoppable. Towns that the railroad skipped were left to wither. Others boomed, becoming cities almost overnight. The wilderness was shrinking, mile by mile, rail by rail. And while the frontier spirit didn't disappear, it was no longer isolated. It was plugged in, connected, and commercialized. The frontier was still wild, but now it ran on steam and signals. By the end of the 19th century, something profound had changed. The line that once separated wilderness from settlement, the famed frontier line, had blurred, faded, and finally disappeared. In 1890, the US Census Bureau officially declared, "There can hardly be said to be a frontier line." In other words, the American frontier was closed. The great push westward was over. The forests had been cleared. The railroads linked coast to coast. The buffalo were nearly gone. Tribes were confined to reservations. The land, once vast and mysterious, had been measured, mapped, and sold by the acre. But what did that mean? For some, it meant victory. The dream had been realized, a continent tamed, a nation stretched from sea to sea. For others, especially native peoples and displaced communities, it meant erasure, loss, and a bitter silence where homelands had once been. Yet the end of the frontier wasn't just about geography, it was about identity. The rugged individualism, the myth of the lone pioneer, the campfire stories of heroism and hardship, these didn't vanish. They became legend. Writers like Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had shaped the very soul of America, its democracy, its grit, its restlessness. The frontier taught Americans to adapt, to survive, to rely on themselves and their neighbors. It gave birth to the cowboy, the log cabin president, the gold rush prospector, all icons woven into the fabric of national myth. But the reality was messier. The frontier was sweat, dirt, disease, and death. It was brave and brutal, hopeful and unjust. It was full of contradictions, and its legacy remains a reflection of that tension. Today the frontier lives on, not in geography, but in spirit, in the idea that pushing into the unknown, whether it's land, science, or space, defines what it means to be American. The wagons no longer roll, the cabins are museums, the trails are highways. But if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes in the prairie wind, carried on stories passed down from those who dared to go farther. The American frontier didn't vanish. It became the foundation. Neem. Before there were instruments, there was rhythm, the beat of a foot on earth, the clap of two hands, the thump of a heart in a quiet chest. Music did not begin with wood or string or bone. It began with the body. It began with breath. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing, agriculture or architecture, early humans found something extraordinary in sound. In caves and on plains, around fires and in forests, they discovered that certain movements, a stomp, a shout, a whistle, could stir emotion, call attention, or even comfort fear. Music, it seems, is not a cultural invention. It is a biological instinct. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled in the flickering light of a fire. One begins to hum, a low rising tone. Another claps in rhythm. A third starts to mimic bird calls. There are no words, just sound. And in that moment, they are no longer just individuals surviving the elements. They are connected. They are human. Before the flute, before the drum, sound itself was sacred. Many anthropologists believe that early music may have emerged from imitation, copying animal calls for hunting or mimicking natural sounds to communicate across distances. But at some point, these sounds crossed the line from utility to expression. A rhythm became more than a signal. It became a language of emotion. A hum became a lullaby. A scream became a song. There's a theory that music came before language, or at least alongside it, that before we spoke, we sang. Infants even today respond more instinctively to tone and melody than to speech. Something about pitch, rhythm, and vibration is hardwired into us. We didn't just invent music, we remembered it. And perhaps most beautifully, these first sounds weren't reserved for the elite or the gifted. They were universal, a shared experience of early humans across continents. Music was made in Africa, Asia, Europe. Anywhere there were voices and hands and something to strike or shake. Before the first flute was carved from bone, before strings were stretched and drums were skinned, humans already knew. Sound could move the soul. And that was just the beginning. In the chill of Ice Age Europe, where mammoths roamed and glaciers carved the land, a quiet revolution took place, not in tools or fire, but in sound. Somewhere in a cave, an early human picked up a hollow bird bone, bored a few holes into it, and blew. Out came a tone, pure, haunting, intentional. This was no accident. This was the birth of the musical instrument. archaeologists have uncovered bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years, making them some of the oldest known instruments on Earth. Found in sites like the Hohlfels cave in Germany, these flutes were made from vulture wing bones or mammoth ivory, not easy materials to work with. But their makers took the time to carve finger holes at precise intervals, allowing for a range of notes. That precision tells us something profound. This wasn't random. It was music. Structured, repeatable, crafted for expression. Why did they do it? Perhaps the sound mimicked birdsong, a call to nature. Perhaps it accompanied rituals, marking the transition from life to death or the passage of seasons. Or maybe, just maybe, someone made a flute because they wanted to make beauty in the darkness. It's easy to think of prehistoric humans as crude, focused solely on survival. But the flute suggests otherwise. It speaks of creativity, of a mind that looked at a bone and didn't see food, but possibility. These instruments also imply community. A flute played alone makes music, yes, but in a group, it creates rhythm, harmony, and shared experience. Around a fire, flutes may have joined voices, clapping or drumming on logs and stones. The music would rise, echoing off cave walls, the first concerts in human history. And consider this. These Ice Age flutes predate the invention of agriculture, the wheel, and even writing. In the hierarchy of innovation, music came early, not as a luxury, but as a need. The flutes of the Ice Age weren't just tools. They were expressions of joy, sorrow, mystery, and ritual. Fragile whispers from the deep past, still capable of moving us today. From bone and breath, humanity made melody. If the flute was our first voice, then the drum was our heartbeat. Long before cities, long before kings, there were circles of people gathered under stars, clapping, stomping, and pounding rhythm into the ground. The drum wasn't invented in one place. It emerged everywhere, across continents and cultures, as if the human body and Earth itself were asking to be synchronized. The earliest drums were likely simple: stretched animal skin over a hollow log or clay pot. They were tools of rhythm, yes, but also of ritual, communication, and power. A drum beat could summon a god, lead an army, or call a village together. It wasn't just noise, it was a signal. In Africa, some of the oldest known drum traditions trace back tens of thousands of years. There, drums became voices, instruments that could speak tonal languages, mimicking human phrases. In Siberia, shamans used drums to enter trances, their rhythms unlocking gateways to the spirit world. In the Amazon, the sound of a water drum echoed through the jungle like thunder made by human hands. What made the drums so essential wasn't just its sound, but its universality. You didn't need melody. You didn't need formal training. You just needed to feel the beat. And feel it we did. Drums were used in birth ceremonies, funerals, weddings, harvests, and wars. Their pulse gave structure to chaos. A rhythm could bind a tribe together, unify a ritual, or prepare warriors for battle. The beat said, "We are one." Even in early agriculture, drumming had a place. Farmers beat sticks to scare away birds. Harvest festivals featured dances led by drum beats. Rhythm marked time, not just hours, but seasons, cycles, and transitions. Over time, drums evolved. People added carvings, paint, and spiritual symbols to their instruments. Drums were not just functional, they were sacred objects, representing fertility, protection, or divine connection. And always, they connected us. Across language barriers, across generations, across worlds. In a world before clocks, electricity, or writing, rhythm was how we counted, and how we felt. Drums brought sound to life. They made time tangible. And in their pounding, we found not just music, we found meaning. As humanity moved from caves to cities, music evolved from survival ritual into sophisticated art. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. where rivers carved kingdoms and writing was born. Here, music began to look elegant. Among the temples and ziggurats, we find some of the earliest depictions of stringed instruments, harps and lyres, drawn on tablets, carved into walls, and even buried with kings. These weren't bone flutes made in secret. They were crafted with care, adorned with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, their curves as graceful as their sound. The harp, in particular, became a symbol of refinement, religion, and royalty. Just an instrument, but a myth in wood and string. These early harps didn't have frets or fingerboards. Strings were plucked by hand, and each tone was fixed. But what they lacked in flexibility, they made up for in atmosphere. A Mesopotamian harp didn't shout like a drum. It whispered. Its notes hung in the air like incense, sacred, dreamlike. In these cities, music became organized. Musicians were trained. Scales and intervals were recorded in cuneiform. The harp was used in ceremonies, storytelling, and even astronomy, as scholars mapped the stars and matched them to harmonies, believing the heavens themselves sang in celestial intervals. The presence of harps in Mesopotamian burial sites tells us something profound. Music was believed to follow the soul beyond death. It wasn't just entertainment. It was spiritual architecture, building bridges between worlds. And unlike the thunder of drums or the primal howl of flutes, harps brought a new quality to music. Intimacy. Soft, thoughtful, deliberate. For the first time, perhaps, sound was not just for the gods or the tribe. It was for reflection. With a stretched string and a wooden frame, Mesopotamians gave voice to silence. And from that silence, the first melodies of civilization were born. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't just an art, it was a divine language. The Egyptians believed that music was a gift from the gods. According to myth, it was the goddess Bat, later merged with Hathor, the goddess of joy, fertility, and music, who first brought song into the world. And so, music became more than melody. It was ritual, identity, and spiritual architecture, resonating through temples, tombs, and marketplaces alike. Unlike the primal flutes of prehistory or the ceremonial harps of Mesopotamia, Egyptian music blended ritual precision with everyday life. Workers sang to keep rhythm as they built pyramids. Fishermen sang to the Nile. Priests performed hymns during sacred rites. Women played frame drums and rattles during childbirth and funerals, moments of beginning and end. The most iconic Egyptian instruments were harps, lutes, lyres, sistrums, and flutes. Harps evolved from simple angular shapes to large, curved, decorative pieces with long, arched necks, symbols of status as much as sound. Some had up to 22 strings, crafted with such elegance that they appear in tomb paintings, still vivid 3,000 years later. The sistrum, however, held a unique place. A type of rattle with metal rods that jingled when shaken, it was closely associated with goddess worship, especially that of Hathor and Isis. The sound wasn't meant for amusement. It was meant to awaken the divine, to shake off evil, and to protect the soul during ceremonies. Musicians in Egypt weren't always commoners. Some were priests or priestesses, serving in temples through music. Others were court musicians, entertaining pharaohs and foreign dignitaries with songs praising gods, kings, and legacy. Music also bridged worlds. In funerals, songs and chants guided the soul through the underworld. Tombs of the wealthy often included lyrics, and even illustrations, of instruments and musicians, as if to ensure the departed would be accompanied by sound in the afterlife. For ancient Egyptians, music was eternal. It honoured the gods, unified the people, and reminded them of cosmic order. Ma'at. Rhythm wasn't chaos. It was the heartbeat of the universe. In Egypt, to make music was to echo the sacred. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't just an art form. It was a science of the soul and of the universe itself. While other civilizations used music in ritual and celebration, the Greeks asked a deeper question. why does sound move us? And their answer was found not just in poetry or philosophy, but in mathematics. Enter Pythagoras, the philosopher best known today for his triangle, but who also played a monumental role in the origins of music theory. According to legend, Pythagoras passed a blacksmith's shop and noticed something strange. The sound of hammer strikes changed depending on the size and weight of the hammers. This inspired an experiment with strings. He discovered that when a string was divided in simple ratios, like 1.2 or 2.3, it produced consonant, harmonious tones. This revelation birthed the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that the cosmos itself operated on mathematical ratios, and that music was an echo of universal order. Every plucked string wasn't just a note, it was a mirror of the heavens. Greek instruments reflected this philosophy. The lyre, a small harp-like instrument, became a symbol of civilization and education. Poets like Homer and Sappho were often depicted with one in hand. The aulos, a double-reeded pipe, provided the wild, emotive contrast, played in dramas, rituals, and sometimes in war. Music in Greece was deeply tied to ethics and character. The philosopher Plato believed different musical modes could influence the soul, some inspiring courage, others promoting laziness or chaos. He advocated for strict musical education to shape ideal citizens. In his view, the wrong scale could be as dangerous as poor governance. But for the Greeks, music wasn't about entertainment alone. It was medicine. It was morality. It was mathematical perfection vibrating through flesh and air. They laid the foundations for music theory, notation systems, and acoustics. Their understanding of intervals, scales, and harmony would echo for centuries through Roman, medieval, and modern thought. In Greece, music became more than sound. It became a bridge between reason and emotion, between numbers and beauty, a place where the soul could both calculate and soar. If Greece gave music its philosophy, Rome gave it volume. In the Roman world, music was about function, form, and force. It accompanied festivals, religious ceremonies, gladiator games, and most famously, the battlefield. Where the Greeks saw music as a bridge to the divine, the Romans saw it as a tool of order and empire. One of the most iconic instruments of Roman power was the cornu, a massive, curved brass horn shaped like a G and often taller than the soldier who carried it. The cornu wasn't for melody, it was for command. Its blast signalled troop movements, battle charges, and retreat orders across noisy battlefields. Roman generals didn't just shout, they orchestrated war. Alongside the cornu was the tuba, no relation to the modern one, a straight trumpet that could cut through the chaos of combat. Together, these instruments helped keep the Roman army, the most disciplined force in the world, moving in sync. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers marching in time to the brassy, haunting calls of these ancient horns. It wasn't just organization. It was psychological warfare. But Roman music wasn't all military. In temples, tibiae, double flutes, accompanied sacred rites. In arenas, music opened gladiator games, not unlike a modern national anthem before a sporting event. At banquets, lyres and hydraulis, an early water-powered pipe organ, created ambience for elite guests. Music flowed through Roman daily life like wine, structured, performative, essential. They borrowed heavily from the Greeks, but reworked everything to fit their own ethos. Where Greece emphasized individual expression and introspection, Rome emphasized public spectacle and control. Music was entertainment and propaganda, and when Rome absorbed Egypt, Judea, Gaul, and beyond, it absorbed their sounds too. Roman music became a mosaic, blending African rhythms, Eastern melodies, and Mediterranean instruments into something vast and ever-evolving. Yet unlike Greek philosophers, Roman thinkers wrote little about the theory of music. They played it, used it, marched to it, but rarely analysed it. For Rome, sound was a means, not a mystery. In the end, Rome didn't refine music. It amplified it, until even the farthest provinces heard the beat of the empire's drums. While the West marched to the rhythms of empire, the East was exploring something else, the soul of sound. In ancient India, music was not merely an art form, it was a path to the divine. Rooted in the Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in existence, Indian music began as chant. The Samaveda, in particular, was a collection of hymns designed not just to be read, but sung. These chants followed intricate melodic patterns called saman, meant to elevate consciousness and harmonize the universe. As Indian civilization evolved, so did its instruments. The veena, an early stringed instrument, became associated with Saraswati, goddess of knowledge and the arts. The mridangam, a barrel-shaped drum, kept time during sacred performances. Every note, every rhythm was tied to ragas and talas, melodic and rhythmic frameworks that were believed to evoke specific emotions, times of day, even spiritual states. Music wasn't for entertainment. It was discipline, meditation, a way to balance inner energies and touch the eternal. Meanwhile, in ancient China, music was equally sacred, but also political. The legendary Emperor Shun, one of China's mythical 5 emperors, was said to have harmonized the empire through music. Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, held that proper music led to moral behavior and social order. The right notes created harmony not just in the soul, but in the state. Instruments were carefully designed to reflect cosmic balance. The guqin, a 7-stringed zither, was played in solitude by scholars and sages. Its soft, meditative tones, meant to reflect introspection and virtue. The sheng, a mouth-blown reed instrument, symbolized unity through its many pipes working as one. The bianzhong, a set of bronze bells, was used in royal courts to represent hierarchy and ritual structure. Chinese music was tuned to precise mathematical intervals that matched natural cycles, aligning humanity with the heavens. In both India and China, music was not separate from life. It was life, a mirror of the cosmos, a code of discipline, a sacred pulse. While Rome used music to conquer, the East used it to commune, with the divine, with nature, with the self. From the thrum of bone flutes in Ice Age caves to the shimmering strings of Mesopotamia, from Egyptian sistrums that summoned gods to Chinese zithers that calmed emperors. Music has always been more than entertainment. It is a language without borders, a force that predates empires and outlasts them. But why has music endured when so many other inventions have faded? Because music speaks directly to something we can't explain, the emotional center of our being. It comforts, warns, excites, unites, mourns. It's what a lullaby offers to a crying child, what a funeral drum says when words fall short, what a national anthem stirs before a battle or a game. Music is intuitive. A melody from the Andes can move someone in Africa. A drum beat from a Polynesian island might feel familiar to someone in Scandinavia. It's not the notes we recognize. It's the feeling they carry. And music is flexible. It adapts. It absorbs. It survives colonization, migration, war, and revolution. Instruments cross oceans. Songs change languages. Scales evolve. But the core remains. Rhythm, tone, expression. Across history, we've used music to define identity. Tribes, nations, religions, revolutions, all have had their songs. But we've also used it to transcend identity, to collaborate, to connect. Music doesn't require a shared tongue. It only requires ears and a heart that listens. Modern science now confirms what ancient wisdom intuited. Music alters brainwaves, reduces stress, and triggers memory. Alzheimer's patients, even when words vanish, remember melodies. Soldiers cope with trauma through sound. Babies respond to lullabies before they can speak. We've turned music into therapy, into protest, into worship, into business, into life. In a world fractured by language, belief, and geography, music remains a rare constant, a human signature that traces back to our earliest ancestors, blowing into bird bones and thumping rhythm into stone. No matter how far we advance, in AI, in space, in technology, music reminds us of our origins. It reminds us that we are not machines. We are feeling, thinking, dreaming beings. And as long as we live, we will keep making music. Because long before we had stories to tell, we had sound. And sound made us human.